Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us to our special presentation of President's Day. Well, tonight we will take a look at the Trump presidency. It's only been a month, but it already has certainly made its mark. We're going to discuss whether this country has ever seen anything like this before. Then a look at the life and legacy of our longest serving president, Franklin Roosevelt. What he did back then is still resonating to this day. Also, George Washington's connection to our area, how our first president spent time right here in our area, including in White Plains, while commanding troops in the Revolutionary War. He fought here, slept here, and he helped win the war as well here. But we start first with our 45th president. Here is Donald Trump's assessment of his first month in office.
I turn on the TV, open the newspapers, and I see stories of chaos. Chaos. Yet it is the exact opposite. This administration is running like a fine-tuned machine.
Okay, he may be grading on a curve as things certainly don't seem to be going that smoothly. His first month, it has been marked by a flurry of executive actions, including the chaotic travel ban that caused chaos at airports before it was overturned by the courts. And don't forget about the rambling press conferences where he attacks usually the press, but also makes statements after statement that are disproven here and making fact checkers' heads all but spin. Then there is the Michael Flynn scandal, where the president had to fire his own national security advisor after he made contact with the Russians and lied about it. And don't forget about the incomprehensible foreign policy. He's refused to denounce our longtime foe, Russia, but he's alienated allies like Australia and Mexico. And he's also given mixed messages about things like Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, nuclear weapons, China policy, and I could go on and on. Well, it leaves us with a whole lot to speak to my first guest about. Scott Bland is Politico's editor of Campaign Pro. He's kind enough to join us now. And Scott, there's so many places to start here in this short of a window into this administration, but nonetheless, let's dive in. And first, let's start with the folks who should be least surprised, theoretically, people that were adamant that this was a president that was unqualified for the office, and they ascribed all the worst motivations to what he'd do if, in fact, he was elected. Are even they shocked, Democrats on the Hill and others, as to what these 30 days have looked like so far?
Well, I think they are, and for a few different reasons. I think, first of all, a number of Trump's most ardent opponents didn't fully grapple with some of the things that he said during the campaign he would do, because they were so sure, as many people were, that they would never come to pass, because he trailed in the polls for the entire, virtually the entire election until he ended up winning on Election Day. And so I think that's one of the reasons why some people maybe have been surprised over the last few weeks. But overall, and the president said it himself at his news conference, the policies that he's put forward largely are ones that he talked about at great length during the campaign. And at times we were told that we shouldn't be taking him so literally, perhaps, or that it was just rhetoric. But lo and behold, here we are, and he's putting out the executive order on refugees and immigration, and any number of other things.
Do you think the part that is most jarring to, let's just not limit it to Democrats, but people who've followed Washington and expected certain norms, is it more the temperament? Is it the dysfunction within the administration? Is it the seemingly conflicting messages that happen on a daily basis? Is it the stylistic thing that he's doing this at Twitter at 2 in the morning? What's the part that people just still can't believe that they're seeing, especially from those most critical of him?
I think it's hard to separate a lot of the factors that you just listed from each other, but I think certainly the style is really surprising people. I mean, Trump himself said that he was going to stop tweeting if and when he became president, and that obviously hasn't happened, and that continues to drive a lot of news, and a lot of the stuff that he is saying on Twitter is not particularly diplomatic. But I think it's a combination of all these things. You mentioned some of the operations within the White House. The White House at the top levels is being staffed by people who do not have government experience, starting with Trump himself, who has never been in elected office. You've got his chief of staff is a former party chairman, is very experienced politically, but not at running a government operation. His chief strategist is a former media executive, and so on and so forth down the line.
You know, you go to the other side of the aisle, Scott, and on Thursday, I was in Washington with that 77-minute press conference, and the reports of Republicans being slack-jawed is putting it politely. I spoke to a few getting ready to go home from Reagan National. One of them called it a bleep show. One of them says, I'm still picking my jaw off the floor here. We don't know what we're in for, let alone what we got into. Is the overwhelming sentiment from Republicans, well, this is what we have to work with. Let's try and get our agenda moving forward here. We'll just, bite our lip here and go along to get along. Or even certain Republicans, if not a growing number, saying, we're pretty close to a bridge too far that I just won't cross because I don't know what's on the other end.
Yeah, I don't know how close we are to that bridge because, as you mentioned, Republicans in Congress have their own agenda that they want to pass, and they've been waiting for 8 years for a Republican president to work with, and they're really looking forward to doing a lot of those things, to repealing Obamacare, to tax reform, regulatory reform, a whole list of issues. And I think it's important that even as you see some of these quotes from Republican officials who are surprised or dismayed at the behavior during the press conference and things like that, Pew just came out with a poll that's backed up by a lot of other polls that show Trump's approval among self-identified Republicans is as high as any previous Republican presidents has been at this point in his presidency. Now, his approval rating is low compared to the rest of them because he's doing terribly among independents and Democrats. But for the moment, Republicans are sticking with him. And I'm sure at some point there's a point for everyone at which they would be willing to not stick with him anymore. But I don't think we certainly haven't reached it yet, and I'm not sure exactly where that point is.
Well, one of the things that I did take away from some of that polling was the antipathy for those who disagree with the president. It's as strong as we've ever seen. And it's manifesting itself not just on hardline liberal Democrats, but on independents as well, Scott. So my point is, sure, Republicans look at this and say, the base likes me, but if you're not in a red area, at some point you say, I don't want to be aligned with it. I know from in our market in the tri-state area, there are certain Republicans that are very noticeably being mum when it comes to Trump, and they're avoiding certain things because they're worried about the pushback on this right now. And we're only, as we said, a month into this. That fear of the unknown, not just what he's already done and the positions he's staked out, but what he might say next. I find it palpable. Do you? I really sense a lot of Republicans that have something to worry about in less than 2 years or 4 years saying, I don't know what I'm in for here.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting and important to watch both next week while Congress is on recess and everyone's back in their districts, and also over the next year or so how the 2 or 3 dozen House Republicans in the most vulnerable swing districts react at home. Are they holding town halls? Are those town halls getting rowdy? And another thing we've noticed in the polls is that even in surveys where close to equal numbers of Americans approve and disapprove of President Trump, the number of people who strongly disapprove of him outweighs the strong supporters. And so you've got this intensity of opposition that is not just the total numbers, but the intensity of opposition is on the side of the president's detractors at this point. And I think that is also something that some local Republicans in some of these swing areas will find themselves concerned with, because ultimately, especially heading into a midterm election or even apart from politics, just pressure from constituents, it's often the most motivated side that can make a real impact, because they feel strongly, they're getting in touch with their elected representatives, they're pressuring them with letters and phone calls and showing up at these town hall meetings. So I think that's an important part of this too. It's the intensity of the opposition, as you mentioned, not just the total amount of it.
Finally, Scott, I think one way we're going to see a real test as to either the level of support or opposition as it relates to the president on the Hill will be the Russian investigation. More specifically, who will conduct it? Will it be a bipartisan commission? Will it fall along with Republican majority lines? Will they appoint an independent prosecutor? You do have the McCains and the Grahams and the Sasses of the world who don't have to worry about an election, who are willing to stick their neck out right now. Do you think those voices grow louder? And I could make just a purely political calculation argument that if you're Republicans, you'd want to have a bipartisan commission so people have equal skin in the game on this, and you're not left being accused of whitewashing anything at the end of the day. What do you think happens as it relates with who does the investigating for Russia, aside from the parallel investigation of the FBI?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's one that we're still finding out more about day by day. And I think a lot of it depends on future stories that come out. I mean, just in the past week, we've seen significantly more momentum build for looking into the connections between Russia and Donald Trump's advisors in his campaign, and some people who ended up in his White House. Just with the breaking of the stories about former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn misleading Vice President Pence about the content of some conversations he had with the Russian ambassador during the transition. And the question is, how many more stories like that are out there, and also what else is going to happen in the meantime that might distract and push away from that. Just this week, the number of storylines we've had to focus on has been enormous. We had a cabinet nominee get withdrawn. We had another one get introduced at the beginning of that long press conference, which ended up being story 10 or 11, out of that total 77-minute affair. And so I think part of it depends on how much more focus and how many more stories and how much more public pressure comes to bear on some of these senators, like you said.
And oh my God, it's only been a month. But anyway, Scott, keeping us busy. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, coming up next, everybody, a look back. How does Donald Trump in his first month here compare to prior presidents? Has his administration been like anything else we've seen before? Well, our political panel will join us, including a historian. That's straight ahead.